Hey guys, so this is part two. One of the challenges of trying to find some time to do this and doing it at work is, calls come in and you're needed. But let me pick up my train of thought where I was. I was talking about I wasn't really knocking the fact that celebrity deaths and things like that get publicized. It's more about there's hundreds of people, thousands of people across this country every day that are battling whatever it might be, or whatever disease, and never a word really gets mentioned of them. And as I said, I was growing up when I was a formidable kid and developing opinions into a teenager. Was in the 70s and 80s, and we weren't at war, but the newspaper industry was big, and I used to kind of read the newspaper, at least thumb through it, front to back, actually back to front because the sports from the back. I started there, but I used to kind of laugh at the hypocrisy of how I wondered how the rest of the world sees Americans. You always hear the term "the ugly American," and I don't know that that's really who we are, or that's really how we're even seen. But I've heard the term. But I used to kind of I want to say laugh isn't the right word, but be puzzled by the fact that there were countries, there were times when Ireland and Northern Ireland was at battling with bombs and blowing people up over religious factions, and the Middle East was just crazy. Car bombs and people blowing up centers, and it would always get a blurb about that big in the paper on about page 9 or 10, and it just struck me as odd that you know, and I guess this is a reality. If it doesn't happen to us, and it's even whether it doesn't happen to us, it's not a big deal. Um, and I don't mean us necessarily just as Americans. In this case, I do. But I mean, even on a personal level, somebody over there, got a whatever it might be, an arrest for something. Happens every day, no big deal. But it happens to somebody you work with, or you live with, or you somehow know or friends with, and then to you that's newsworthy. And I'd read about this, and it happened, with this New Zealand thing. This crazy person, uh, lunatic, goes in and live streams himself killing 49 people in New Zealand, and that is catastrophic when you think about it. The hate and the loss of life. Um, and yes, it gets covered here in America, but the newspaper industry is far less relevant to what it used to be because now we're also instantaneous. And yes, the Yahoos and the news coverages and the digital news has covered it a little bit, but there's no discussion of it in everyday American life. It's just not. But if we have a school shooting or we have some catastrophe here in America, um, it carries so much more weight. I just don't really. Maybe I do understand it. I just wonder about it. Why do we? Why is halfway around the world 49 lives so? I don't want to say less meaningful, but so easy to put out of our mind than if it happened here in the states. So that was one of the things I wanted to talk about. Was just I know it is empty when you say prayers and thoughts are with the folks and families, but just take a moment to realize that 49 people went to a mosque that day and didn't come out alive and had no agenda or interest in anything negative, and hate took over, and see how that impacts your lives here. Maybe you can point the thumb at yourself today and change a little bit, or just appreciate a little bit more something that you may have already had: family, job, work, or whatever. And then the other thing I want to talk about happened yesterday, and it'll go back to sports to some degree. So many years ago, many of you might know the name Peyton Manning. Was a Hall of Fame NFL quarterback, and the poster child for corporate America, and doing all sorts of endorsements. And before he became Peyton Manning, the NFL player, was Peyton Manning, the college football player, and he had um, and when the draft came, there was talk between him and another gentleman named Ryan Leaf. And Ryan Leaf was a quarterback that came out of Washington State, and was talked about as being a potential star. Uh, Ryan, at the time, wasn't a very likable person. Was felt entitled, and his story is that he got to the NFL and from a professional quarterback standpoint, was a bust. In fact, most people will say he might be the biggest bust in draft history. And that doesn't necessarily have to make him a bad person. The problem is that one of the reasons that I think he was a bust was because he was a bad person. He just wasn't. He's renowned for his petulant behavior and screaming at some reporters and some different things. And when he was out of football, I don't know all of the details, but I know that he ended up getting hooked on prescription painkillers and stealing and robbing from people to support the habit. He found himself in prison, and he really hit rock bottom. And the story of Ryan Leaf, somewhere along the way, he found redemption, and I definitely think that he got an opportunity that that other people may not have gotten just because he wasn't sports. So somewhere along, he made a contact with somebody that you or I wouldn't have the ability to make a contact with, but that person believed in him and gave him a second chance. And Ryan Leaf has made not just a recovery from the drug addiction, the prescription drug addiction, but what I really admire about him, he was actually filling in on the Rich Eisen radio show yesterday. And I've seen him many times on TV and his story, because it is a pretty remarkable one. But what I admire most about his redemption is that he hasn't made, anytime I've heard him, he hasn't made one excuse. He hasn't done anything but point the thumb. I mean, so many guys. Let me give you an example. So there was there's a national radio host right now in sports named Doug Gottlieb. Doug went to the University of Notre Dame for a year. When he was kicked out because he was caught stealing a computer or something along those lines, and he was caught stealing and kicked out, and he transferred to Oklahoma State and is now, in business and the whole bit. But when someone talks to him about that past, it's a black mark, and he doesn't really talk about it much. And maybe he shouldn't talk about it much. I don't know. I don't think that his actions at 19 years old defines who he is, but I do find it funny that how sometimes a black mark on an everyday person can follow you around for a long, long time. But Ryan Leaf completely owns everything about himself, and what he did, and who he was, and how unlikable he was, and is very grateful for where he is now, and at least claims to be able, will pick up the phone and talk to just about anybody who's interested, which I believe when you hear him talk. But he said one thing yesterday that I thought was so profound. And again, I'm not condoning what he did or who he was, but I really admire people that own who they are and recognize and don't try to justify or defend. At no point did he ever try to justify his behavior and well, because of this or because of that. He was just a bad guy and did bad things. And but what I found so remarkable yesterday in listening to him was he said one of the things that you have to do is you have to go out and find people and ask for help. And I've talked about that on the journey. Part of the journey for me was a struggle because I don't ask for help very easily. And when it's hard to lower your ego, your pride, to be able to ask for help. And what he said, secondly, that was profound, was not only when you have to ask for the help, but when you get the advice, when you get the suggestions, you have to apply them. So many people go through the first step of the motion and check their ego and their pride and say, hey, what do you think about this? But the reality is, and I'm going to speak, firsthand from some work relationships, from some personal relationships, people want your help, or at least they say they do, but I really don't think they do. They ask for advice, and then when you share it with them, they didn't really want it because they want to go and do their own thing anyway. And Ryan admitted that too as part of his deal, was basically saying, hey, one of the hardest things for me was taking the advice and applying it. What he was doing wasn't working. And he went to people that were more successful than him and asked them what they did and how they did it, personally and professionally. And it wasn't until he started to adapt that he didn't have all the answers and adapt to the suggestions they made, the coaching they offered, the mentorship they offered, is when he finally started to see the light and turn his life around a little bit. And I don't think that any of us have all the answers, certainly not in a grand scheme of things. But how many of us really, when we talk to somebody, are talking and having an open mind to their response or their observations, or are we talking to one either hope that they kind of just agree with us and say, yeah, no, I mean, I see what you're talking about. Yeah, I'd be pissed about that, or I would have done this too, and I don't blame you, or are we just kind of, when they give us a different opinion than what we want to hear, do we acknowledge that, or does another one that doesn't understand or get it? So if you get a chance, Google Ryan Leaf's story. It's a pretty remarkable story, but more than the story itself is, I think, just the way he's handled himself, in the sense that he has owned his transgressions every step of the way, and I couldn't respect or admire somebody more for that. So it hasn't been easy for him, just like it's not easy for a lot of us out there. But to deny it or justify it or minimize what we did or why we did it just doesn't serve any purpose whatsoever. So I love you guys. I know it's been a while. I know you have 2 videos today, so kind of long. But just want to get back out there with you. The book is restarted again and coming along. Hopefully things will settle down over here. And I'm just rocking and rolling, guys. So I'm sorry that it's been a week or so. Just beat up a little bit mentally, emotionally, even physically. And we'll get there. All right? So love you all. Thanks for following Point the Thumb. And I'll talk to you soon.